In the dust-choked town of Millbrook, Texas, 1887, drought has withered dreams and hardened hearts. When weathered farmer Samuel Hayes discovers a starving Native American child abandoned at his gate, his simple act of giving his last coin sets in motion a chain of events that will shake the very foundations of prejudice and reveal the true meaning of justice in the Wild West. What happens when a desperate farmer's final act of kindness awakens forces beyond his imagination? Stay with us through this incredible true story of courage, redemption, and the power of human compassion that changed an entire community forever. The merciless Texas sun beat down on Samuel Hayes' cracked fields like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. Dust devils danced across what should have been rows of corn, mocking his desperate prayers for rain. Samuel wiped the sweat from his weathered brow and squinted at the barren landscape that had once been his pride. 3 consecutive years of drought had reduced his once prosperous farm to little more than hardpan earth and broken dreams. At 52, Samuel's hands told the story of a lifetime spent wresting sustenance from stubborn soil. His calloused fingers, now trembling slightly from exhaustion and worry, clutched the final silver dollar in his pocket, his last connection to solvency. The bank notice, crumpled in his other hand, bore the harsh reality: foreclosure in 30 days unless he could produce the impossible sum of $200. The small town of Millbrook stretched before him like a mirage, its wooden buildings shimmering in the heat. Once a thriving community of farmers and ranchers, it now wore the gaunt look of a place slowly dying. Half the storefronts stood empty, their windows like hollow eyes staring at nothing. The remaining businesses struggled to serve a population that had dwindled from 800 souls to barely 300 in just 5 years. Samuel's wife Martha had been buried in the town cemetery just 2 winters past, claimed by consumption that the traveling doctor couldn't cure. Their only son, Thomas, had headed west to California the previous spring, chasing gold rush dreams and leaving behind only a hastily scrawled promise to send money when he struck it rich, a promise that had yet to materialize. As Samuel trudged down Main Street, his worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust, he noticed the familiar faces of his neighbors. Mrs. Henderson swept her porch with mechanical precision, her movements sharp with the kind of anger that comes from watching everything you've worked for slowly slip away. Old Pete Morrison sat in his usual spot outside the general store, whittling a piece of wood into nothing in particular, his eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd given up hope. The general store's proprietor, Edgar Whitman, barely looked up when Samuel entered. The shelves, once full of goods from back east, now displayed their sparse inventory with embarrassing gaps between items. A few cans of beans, some hardtack, tobacco, and ammunition, the bare necessities of survival. "Samuel," Edgar nodded, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken sympathy. Both men knew this might be Samuel's last visit as a paying customer. "Edgar." Samuel's voice was gravelly with dust and emotion. He set his final silver dollar on the scarred wooden counter. "I need whatever this will buy in the way of food." Edgar's weathered hands moved slowly, selecting items with careful consideration. A small bag of beans, some salt pork, and a loaf of day-old bread, enough to last perhaps 3 days if stretched thin. He slid the goods across the counter without taking the coin, his eyes meeting Samuel's with quiet understanding. "Keep your dollar, Sam. Pay me when the rains come." Samuel shook his head firmly. "A man pays his debts, Edgar. That's what separates us from the animals." He pushed the coin forward with finality. The walk home felt longer than usual, the paper bag of meager provisions cradled against his chest like a newborn. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Samuel of better times when such sunsets promised another day of prosperity rather than another day of mere survival. His small farmhouse came into view, its paint long since peeled away by wind and weather. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and several roof shingles lay scattered in the yard where recent storms had torn them loose. It wasn't much, but it was home, or would be for another month. As Samuel approached his front gate, he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Soft sobbing, barely audible above the whisper of wind through dry grass. He quickened his pace and discovered the source. A small figure huddled against his fence post. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, dressed in tattered clothing that had once been a simple dress, but now resembled more of a dusty brown sack. Her long black hair hung in matted strands around a face streaked with tears and dirt. Most striking were her eyes, dark as river stones and filled with a desperation that no child should ever know. Samuel recognized her heritage immediately. The high cheekbones, the copper tone of her weathered skin, the way she held herself despite her obvious distress. She was clearly Native American, likely from one of the displaced tribes that occasionally passed through the territory. "Child," Samuel said softly, setting down his bag of groceries and approaching slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "What are you doing here?" The girl looked up at him with those haunting eyes, and Samuel felt something crack inside his chest. She was starving. He could see it in the hollow of her cheeks, the way her clothes hung loose on her tiny frame, the desperate hunger that radiated from her like heat from a forge. She spoke no English, but her small hand made a universal gesture toward her mouth, then toward her empty stomach. The meaning was unmistakable. Samuel looked at his meager groceries, then at the child, then back at the groceries. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. He had enough food for perhaps 3 days if he ate sparingly. Shared with this child, it might last 1 day, maybe 2. But looking into those eyes, seeing the resignation there, the look of someone who had already begun to accept death, Samuel knew there was really no choice at all. He opened the bag and withdrew the loaf of bread, tearing off a generous portion and offering it to the girl. She took it with trembling hands and devoured it with an intensity that spoke of days, perhaps weeks, without proper food. But bread alone wouldn't be enough. Samuel knew that whoever had abandoned this child, if indeed she had been abandoned, had left her to die. In this harsh land, with winter approaching and no family or community to protect her, she wouldn't survive another week. Samuel reached into his empty pocket, his fingers finding nothing but lint and the faint outline of where his last coin had rested just an hour before. Then he remembered the small tin can hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his kitchen, his emergency reserve. Inside were $3 silver he'd been saving for the most desperate of times. This, he realized, was exactly such a time. The morning sun found Samuel Hayes kneeling beside a makeshift bed he'd fashioned from old blankets in his kitchen. The Native American girl, he'd begun thinking of her as Little Bird, though she hadn't yet told him her real name, slept fitfully, occasionally murmuring words in her native tongue that sounded like prayers or perhaps memories of better times. During the night, Samuel had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. He would care for this child, regardless of the consequences. The $3 silver from his emergency reserve were now gone, spent on additional food, a small bottle of medicine from the traveling apothecary, and a worn but serviceable dress from Mrs. Henderson's charity collection. The morning brought with it an unexpected visitor. Samuel was splitting kindling behind his house when he heard the approaching hoofbeats. Through the dust cloud, he could make out a single rider, a tall man in a dark coat sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to long journeys across difficult terrain. The stranger was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair beneath a well-worn hat and eyes the color of winter sky. What struck Samuel most was the man's bearing. There was something almost military about the way he carried himself, a sense of authority that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a campfire. "Good morning," the stranger called out, dismounting with fluid grace. "I'm looking for information about a missing child." Samuel's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of information?" The man stepped closer, and Samuel could see the details of his face more clearly. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, and a scar along his left jaw that suggested he'd seen his share of violence. But there was also something else, a gentleness in his manner that seemed at odds with his imposing presence. A young girl, Native American, about 8 years old. She was traveling with a group that was displaced about a week ago. We have reason to believe she might have wandered this direction. Samuel chose his words carefully. Displaced how? The stranger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There was a misunderstanding with some local ranchers. Shots were fired. The girl's family, they didn't survive. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. This child had witnessed the murder of her family, had somehow escaped, and had been wandering alone in the wilderness for a week. The miracle wasn't that she had survived, it was that she had maintained any hope at all. "And you are?" Samuel asked. James Standing Bear, the man replied, extending his hand. I work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but not in the way most people think. I try to help families find each other when they've been scattered. Samuel shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of hard work. Samuel Hayes. This is my farm. Standing Bear nodded, his eyes taking in the obvious signs of drought and hardship. Hard times for farmers, I imagine. Hard times for everyone, Samuel replied. Then, after a moment's consideration, he made another decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. The girl you're looking for, she's inside. Standing Bear's eyes widened slightly, and Samuel saw a flash of something that might have been relief cross the man's features. She's safe. She's safe. Hungry, scared, but safe. Samuel gestured toward the house. Though I should warn you, she doesn't speak English and she's been through hell. As they walked toward the house, Standing Bear spoke quietly. Her name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom in her language. She's the daughter of a medicine woman who was traveling with a small group of families, trying to reach relatives in the Colorado Territory. Samuel stopped walking. Medicine woman? Yes. Her mother was considered very powerful among her people. It said she could heal wounds that other doctors couldn't touch, could read the intentions of men's hearts. Standing Bear paused. Among native tribes, the children of medicine women are considered special, protected by spirits. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. What aren't you telling me, Mr. Standing Bear? The other man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the farmhouse. There are things in this world that can't be explained by the reasoning of white men, Mr. Hayes. Things that require a different kind of understanding. They found Ayana awake, sitting at Samuel's small kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap. When she saw Standing Bear, her face transformed, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by something that might have been recognition or perhaps hope. Standing Bear spoke to her in her native language, his voice gentle and flowing like water over stones. Ayana responded with a torrent of words, gesturing toward Samuel and then toward her own chest, her voice rising and falling with emotion. What is she saying? Samuel asked. Standing Bear listened for another moment before turning to Samuel with an expression of profound amazement. She's telling me about the white farmer who gave her his last coin, who shared his food when he had almost nothing, who made her a bed in his home when he could have turned her away. He paused. But that's not the remarkable part. What's the remarkable part? Standing Bear's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She's telling me that her mother's spirit visited her in a dream last night. The spirit told her that the kind farmer would be repaid for his generosity in ways he could never imagine. But first, she must do something for him. Ayana stood up from the table and walked to Samuel, reaching into a small pouch that hung around her neck. From it, she withdrew something that made both men gasp, a piece of rock unlike anything Samuel had ever seen. It was shot through with veins of what looked like pure gold, and it seemed to catch and hold the morning light in a way that was almost supernatural. She pressed the rock into Samuel's weathered hands and spoke a single word in English, her pronunciation careful and deliberate. Gift. Standing Bear stared at the rock, his face pale. Mr. Hayes, do you know what you're holding? Samuel shook his head, unable to take his eyes off the strange, beautiful stone. That's a piece of ore from the Lost Medicine Mountain, a place most people believe is nothing but legend. According to tribal stories, it's where the earth keeps its greatest treasures hidden, revealed only to those who have shown pure kindness without expectation of reward. Samuel looked up from the rock to find both Standing Bear and Ayana watching him with expressions of profound respect. I don't understand, Samuel said. Standing Bear smiled, the first genuine smile Samuel had seen from him. Mr. Hayes, I think you're about to discover that sometimes the universe has a way of rewarding kindness in the most unexpected ways, and I have a feeling this is just the beginning. 3 days after Standing Bear's visit, Samuel Hayes woke to a sound he hadn't heard in over a year, the rumble of wagon wheels and the voices of multiple men approaching his farm. He dressed quickly and stepped onto his porch to find a sight that defied belief. A convoy of wagons stretched down the dirt road leading to his property, at least a dozen vehicles loaded with supplies, equipment, and men. At the head of the procession rode Standing Bear, but he was no longer alone. Beside him rode a distinguished-looking gentleman in an expensive suit, and behind them came what appeared to be an entire work crew. Samuel rubbed his eyes, certain he was still dreaming, but the convoy continued its approach. Ayanna appeared at his elbow, having slept in the small room he'd prepared for her. She looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes and spoke a few words in her native language. "I don't understand, little one," Samuel said gently. She pointed to the approaching wagons and then to the strange piece of ore which Samuel had placed on his kitchen table, where it seemed to glow with an inner light. Then she smiled, the first smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived. Standing Bear dismounted and approached the porch with the well-dressed stranger. "Mr. Hayes, I'd like you to meet Theodore Mackenzie, chief geologist for the Denver Mining Consortium." Mackenzie stepped forward with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mr. Hayes, I understand you've come into possession of some rather unusual mineral specimens." Samuel gestured toward the house. "Just the one piece the girl gave me, though I'm not sure what all the fuss is about." As they entered the kitchen, Mackenzie's eyes immediately locked onto the ore sitting on the table. He approached it with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar, withdrawing a jeweler's loupe from his pocket and examining the rock closely. "Extraordinary," he breathed. "Mr. Hayes, this isn't just gold ore. This is something far more valuable, a matrix of gold, silver, and what appears to be platinum, all naturally occurring in the same specimen. The geological conditions required to create something like this are virtually impossible to replicate." Samuel felt dizzy. "What are you saying?" Mackenzie set down his loupe and turned to face Samuel with the expression of a man about to deliver life-changing news. "I'm saying that if there's more where this came from, and geological logic suggests there must be, you could be sitting on one of the richest mineral deposits in North America." Through the window, Samuel could see the work crews unloading equipment, surveying tools, drilling apparatus, and what looked like enough supplies to support a small army. "I don't understand what's happening here." Standing Bear stepped forward. "Yesterday, I sent a sample of that ore to 3 different assay offices. When the results came back, word spread through the mining community like wildfire. Mr. Mackenzie represents a consortium of investors who are prepared to make you an offer that will change your life." Mackenzie nodded enthusiastically. "We're prepared to offer you a partnership, Mr. Hayes. You retain ownership of your land and 50% of any mineral rights, while we provide all the equipment, labor, and expertise necessary for extraction. Based on preliminary analysis, we estimate this partnership could generate upwards of $1 million in the first year alone." Samuel sat down heavily in his chair, the numbers too large to process. $1 million. It was more money than had probably passed through the entire town of Millbrook in the past decade. "But there's more," Standing Bear continued. "Ayanna has been able to provide some guidance about where the ore might be found. It seems her mother's people have known about this deposit for generations, but according to their beliefs, it could only be revealed to someone who had proven themselves worthy through acts of pure kindness." Samuel looked at the little girl, who was watching the proceedings with an expression of serene satisfaction. She knew? All along, she knew. Standing Bear spoke to Ayanna in her native language, and she responded with a long, musical sentence. "She says her mother's spirit told her that the kind farmer would need help to save his land, and that the earth would provide what was needed, but only after he had proven his heart was pure." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. Surveyors mapped Samuel's property, while geologists took soil samples and examined rock formations. By afternoon, they had identified 3 separate locations where ore-bearing veins appeared to run close to the surface. But the most remarkable discovery came when the crew began digging test shafts. The first hole, located near where Samuel had found Ayanna crying by his gate, struck a rich vein of ore just 8 feet below the surface. The second shaft revealed an even richer deposit. By the third shaft, Mackenzie was practically dancing with excitement. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I've been in this business for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like this. You're not just rich, you're going to be one of the wealthiest men in Texas." As word of the discovery spread, the people of Millbrook came to see for themselves. Old Pete Morrison stood at the edge of Samuel's property, shaking his head in amazement. Mrs. Henderson wept openly, knowing that Samuel's good fortune would likely mean salvation for the entire town. Edgar Whitman from the general store couldn't stop grinning, already calculating how much his business would improve when the mining operation brought hundreds of workers to the area. But the most significant visitor came near sunset. A dust cloud on the horizon resolved into a single rider traveling hard. As the figure drew closer, Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. Even from a distance, he recognized the familiar slouch in the saddle, the particular way the rider held his reins. "Thomas," Samuel whispered. His son rode into the yard like something from a fever dream, his clothes dusty from hard travel, his face burned brown by the California sun. He dismounted in a single fluid motion and strode toward his father with purpose. "Pa," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "I heard about what happened here, about what you did for the Indian girl, about what came after." He paused, his eyes taking in the mining equipment, the work crews, the obvious signs of sudden prosperity. "But that's not why I came back." Samuel felt tears forming in his eyes. "Son?" Thomas reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather pouch, heavy with coins. "I struck it rich in California, Pa. Not gold, silver. Enough to pay off the farm and set us up for life." He looked around at the mining operation with wonder. "Though it looks like you don't need my help anymore." Samuel embraced his son, feeling 20 years of worry and loneliness melt away. "I'll always need you, Thomas. Money can't replace family." As the sun set over Samuel's transformed property, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, he stood with his son on one side and Ayana on the other, watching the sunset over land that had gone from worthless to priceless in the span of a single week. Standing Bear approached them, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Hayes, there's something else you should know. Word of your kindness to Ayana has spread through the native communities across 3 territories. You've become something of a legend, the white farmer who showed mercy to a lost child and was blessed by the spirits for his kindness." Samuel looked down at Ayana, who smiled up at him with those knowing, dark eyes. "What happens to her now?" "That," Standing Bear said, "is up to you. I've found relatives willing to take her in, but—" He paused. "She's told me she considers this her home now, and frankly, after what I've witnessed here, I'm inclined to believe that the spirits have placed her exactly where she belongs." Samuel knelt down to Ayana's level. She spoke a few words in her native language, then switched to carefully pronounced English. "Stay with kind farmer." Samuel felt his heart swell with a happiness he hadn't known since Martha died. "Then stay you shall, little one. Stay you shall." 6 months after the discovery of the lost Medicine Mountain ore on Samuel Hayes's property, the town of Millbrook had transformed from a dying frontier settlement into one of the most prosperous communities in Texas. The Hayes Mining Company employed over 300 men, and the influx of workers had revived every business in town. New buildings rose from the dust where empty lots had stood, and the sound of construction filled the air from dawn to dusk. But prosperity brought its own challenges, and it was on a grey February morning that Samuel would face the greatest test of his newfound wealth and influence. Samuel was reviewing mining reports in his newly built office when Standing Bear burst through the door, his usually composed demeanor shattered by obvious distress. Behind him trailed Sheriff Morrison, old Pete's younger brother, who had taken the badge when the previous sheriff left town, and Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the first trained physician Millbrook had seen in over a decade. "Samuel," Standing Bear said without preamble, "we have a problem, a big one." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his badge glinting in the morning light streaming through the window. "There's been talk in town, Samuel. Some of the newer arrivals, men who came here looking for work, they've been asking questions about Ayana." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. In the months since the mining operation began, he had legally adopted Ayana, and she had flourished under his care. She attended the new school that had been built with mining money, was learning English rapidly, and had become something of a beloved figure in town. Most residents knew the story of how her guidance had led to the discovery of the ore, and they treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. "What kind of questions?" Samuel asked. "Doctor," Hartwell spoke up, her voice tight with anger. "Questions about whether it's proper for a white man to be raising an Indian child. Questions about whether she's really as civilized as she appears." She paused. "And questions about what really happened to her family." Standing Bear's jaw tightened. "The men asking these questions aren't just curious newcomers, Samuel. I've done some checking. 3 of them were part of the group that attacked Ayana's family." They're here because they know she's the only witness to what they did. The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. They're here to silence her. Worse than that, Sheriff Morrison said. They've been spreading poison in the saloons, talking about how unnatural it is for an Indian child to be living in luxury while white families struggle. They're trying to turn sentiment against both of you. Samuel stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Where is Ayana now? Safe, Dr. Hartwell assured him. She's at the school with Miss Patterson, and I've arranged for 2 of your most trusted miners to keep watch. But even as she spoke, the distant sound of shouting voices could be heard from the direction of Main Street. Samuel moved to his window and felt his blood turn to ice. A crowd of perhaps 30 men was moving down the street, and even from a distance, he could see they carried torches and weapons. They're not waiting for nightfall, Standing Bear observed grimly. Sheriff Morrison checked his revolver and straightened his badge. I'll go try to talk sense into them. No, Samuel said firmly. This is my responsibility. He reached for his coat and hat. Standing Bear, can you get word to Thomas? He's at the North Shaft today. Samuel, Dr. Hartwell said, you can't face that mob alone. Half of those men work for you. They won't listen to reason when they're worked up like this. Samuel paused at the door. Then I'll have to give them something else to think about. The crowd had gathered in front of the school by the time Samuel arrived. At their head stood 3 men he didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals with the hard eyes of men accustomed to violence. One of them, a tall man with a scraggly beard and a scar across his cheek, appeared to be their spokesman. Hayes, the man called out when he spotted Samuel. We want to talk to you about that Indian brat you've been harboring. Samuel stepped into the street, placing himself between the crowd and the school. Her name is Ayana, and she's my daughter. Your daughter? The scarred man laughed bitterly. A man doesn't claim a wild animal as his daughter, Hayes. We know what she is, and we know what she's seen. What is it you think she's seen? Samuel asked, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. The spokesman shifted uncomfortably, and Samuel caught the quick glance he exchanged with his 2 companions. Things that ain't true. Indian lies about good Christian men. Ah, Samuel said, understanding flooding through him. You're afraid she'll tell people about the day you murdered her family. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Samuel realized that not all of them knew the full truth of why they'd been gathered. You're calling us murderers? The scarred man demanded. I'm calling you exactly what you are, Samuel replied calmly. Cowards who killed a family of peaceful travelers and then came here to silence the only witness. Standing Bear emerged from the crowd, and Samuel saw that he wasn't alone. Behind him came Thomas, along with 24 of Samuel's most trusted miners, men who had worked for him since the early days of the operation, who respected him not just as an employer, but as a man. But it was what Standing Bear carried that made the crowd fall silent. In his hands was a leather satchel, and from it he withdrew a sheaf of official-looking documents. Gentlemen, Standing Bear announced, his voice carrying the authority of federal law, I hold in my hands sworn statements from 3 separate witnesses who saw these men. He pointed directly at the scarred man and his companions. Attack and murder a family of Cheyenne travelers on the morning of August 15th, 1887. The scarred man's face went pale. That's impossible. There were no witnesses. There were, Standing Bear said with quiet satisfaction. A cavalry patrol was tracking the same group of raiders that had been attacking supply trains. They saw everything. He held up another document. I also have federal warrants for the arrest of Jake Henley, Bart Cousins, and Rufus Grady on charges of murder. The 3 men at the head of the crowd exchanged panicked glances. Samuel could see them calculating their chances, weighing their options. They were outnumbered now, surrounded by men who were no longer sympathetic to their cause. You can't prove nothing, Henley, the scarred man said desperately. Actually, we can, came a new voice from behind the crowd. Everyone turned to see Ayana walking down the school steps, flanked by Miss Patterson and Dr. Hartwell. But it wasn't the little girl they had expected to see. In the months since Samuel had taken her in, Ayana had grown and flourished. She stood straight and proud, her dark eyes blazing with intelligence and determination. She spoke in clear, precise English. I remember your faces. I remember your voices. I remember how you laughed when you killed my mother. The silence that followed was deafening. Here was no cowering child, but a young woman finding her voice and her strength. Henley made a desperate grab for his gun, but before he could clear leather, Thomas had moved. Samuel's son had inherited his father's quick reflexes and strong moral compass, and his Colt was in his hand before Henley's weapon was half drawn. "I wouldn't," Thomas said quietly. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward with iron shackles. "Jake Henley, Bart Cousins, Rufus Grady, you're under arrest for murder." As the three men were led away in chains, the crowd began to disperse. Many of the miners who had been stirred up by false accusations now looked ashamed, understanding how they had been manipulated. But Samuel's attention was focused on Ayanna, who had walked over to stand beside him. She looked up at him with those dark, wise eyes and spoke a single word: "Justice." Samuel knelt down to her level. "Are you all right, little one?" She nodded solemnly. "My mother's spirit can rest now. The bad men will pay for what they did." "Doctor." Hartwell approached them, her medical bag in hand but her expression relieved. "The federal marshal will be here tomorrow to transport the prisoners to trial. Standing Bear says the evidence is overwhelming. They'll likely hang." Samuel stood up, placing a protective hand on Ayanna's shoulder. "Good. But this isn't about revenge. It's about justice, and about making sure something like this never happens again." Standing Bear nodded approvingly. "The Tribal Council has asked me to extend an invitation, Samuel. They want to make you an honorary member of the tribe in recognition of your kindness to Ayanna and your stand for justice today." Samuel looked around at the faces surrounding him: his son Thomas, his adopted daughter Ayanna, the friends and neighbors who had stood with him when it mattered most. The transformation was complete. The desperate farmer who had given his last coin to a crying child had become a man of influence and respect, but more importantly, he had become a symbol of what was possible when kindness and courage worked together. "I'm honored," Samuel said, "but my greatest reward is already here." He gestured to encompass Thomas and Ayanna. "Family. Justice. The knowledge that sometimes when you do the right thing simply because it's right, the universe finds a way to make everything else fall into place." As the sun set over Millbrook that evening, Samuel stood on the porch of his new house, built with mining money but filled with the love of the family that had come together through tragedy and been forged strong through shared trials. Ayanna sat beside him, working on her English lessons, while Thomas played his harmonica, a tune their mother had loved. The last coin Samuel had given to a crying orphan had indeed been returned to him, multiplied beyond measure in ways that had nothing to do with gold or silver, and everything to do with the true treasures of the human heart: love, family, justice, and the knowledge that kindness, once given freely, has a way of creating miracles that echo through generations. In the distance, the sounds of the mining operation continued, the steady rhythm of progress and prosperity. But here on the porch, in the golden light of evening, Samuel Hayes understood that the real treasure had never been buried in the earth at all. It had been waiting all along in the simple act of opening one's heart to those in need, and in discovering that sometimes the greatest rewards come not from what we receive, but from what we choose to give.